Okay. Okay. Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth in our series of History and Theory guest lectures. Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming someone who is no stranger to the studios of Westminster. Formerly a partner in Neave Brown, David Porter Architects, where he worked on high-density urban projects in the Netherlands. David Porter was also a founding partner of Clements and Porter Architects. Meanwhile, in architectural education, he has been president of the Architectural Association and head of the Mackintosh School of Architecture. And now, I'm pleased to say, he teaches on the BA Architecture here at Westminster. But it's his work with Neave Brown that we're going to hear more about this evening, what promises to be a rare insight into a much less well-known project, shall we say. Please welcome David Porter.
Thanks, Richard. Can you hear me, by the way? I've got a little microphone here. It works. You can hear me at the back. That's good. Well, look, thanks. It's a kind of funny period in the life of London, so thanks for coming. But I have a question, first of all. How many of you have heard of Neave Brown? Most of you. I mean, if I'd asked this question 10 years ago in an architecture school in London, I'd have been lucky to get one or two. In Glasgow, where I was teaching, one of the reasons I went to teach in Glasgow is they were still concerned as an architecture school in teaching housing. And so people did know. But what's really gratifying for someone who's spent quite a lot of their life working with Neave is that in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, there's been a revival of interest in council housing in general, but in Neave's work in particular. Partly due to Mark Swinnerton, who's sitting here in the front row, who has written Cook's Camden now into its third printing, which is a fantastic piece of scholarship that actually talks about architecture and puts it in its context, its political and social context. But there's been a revival of interest in Neave's work. And what I'm going to talk about is not the schemes you know well, by which I mean this one, Alexandra Road, the famous one. I'm going to talk about the scheme that we did together. We teamed up in 1986, 30-odd years ago, to 1992, and we worked on a very large project in Holland that has been built, but not under our name. We eventually resigned from it. And I won't go through the hard luck story of that, but I would say that it was something which hurt both of us, having spent that amount of time working very heavily on one project. But this is, I just want to show Alexandra Road, my famous, partly this is the famous view, and this is the less famous view, which is the park. So there's a street in the city that joins two places. People euphemistically use the word street, as in street in the sky, which often means a corridor with the side left off, going from one elevator to another. This street goes from Swiss Cottage through to Abbey Road. And the other side of this block is a park, which is a magic place. And so it's making not of housing, but a part of the city and a landscape. And I put this up. You probably know this. Do you know this? Have you been here? It's just over there. What Neave used to do is to juxtapose slides a lot. And so you'd get things like Nash Terraces with Alexandra Road. And it's very interesting because this work comes designed late 60s and built in the 70s, going back through what was written and how things were written about then. But when Neave writes about all this, the word traditional occurs, traditional street, traditional front door, traditional front steps. Nowadays, you'd use the word innovative. Everything is innovative. But actually, Neave would talk about what is a radical piece of work in terms of its relationship back. And so this is the sort of juxtaposition he would make. But this is the project that I want to talk about, the Zwollsestraat. And there is Neave getting the RIBA gold medal. By that stage, he was seriously ill, and he died shortly after. And I'd worked with Neave as the job architect on Fleet Road. Before that, he'd built 5 houses, which he lived in along with Janet, his then wife, now widow, and brought up a family. They then moved into Fleet Road, and that's where you still are, Janet. So lived in, very much part of Alexandra Road. But I was Neave's assistant on Fleet Road, and I call it my apprenticeship. I left college knowing almost nothing. And so I learnt a huge amount working with Neave. And then later on, we teamed up. And he was a teacher as well as an architect. He came when he was at the AA, which is 1950, that period, not just after the Second World War. It was a group who'd done national service and then went and studied. But having done national service, they had a particular view of the destruction of European cities, having seen them destroyed. And I'll come back to that. That is to say that the group that he was with, which included Kenneth Frampton, Patrick Hodgkinson, John Miller, Adrian Gale, David Gray, a very eminent group, all became academics, and Patrick Hodgkinson, who did the Foundling Estate. And so Neave was both an architect but also a teacher. And so I owe him a debt, both as a colleague but as a teacher. Anyway, I worked on this, and these were built in London and are all listed buildings. And then there was a hiatus after Alexandra Road and Fleet Road were finished. They had been expensive to build. They were built at a time of economic crisis in the UK. And also there'd been a reaction against modern architecture. It was believed in Camden that these would be unlivable and unlettable. They weren't. They have been amazingly successful as places to live and attractive. But it meant that Neave's career in the United Kingdom stopped there, and he never built again in the UK. However, in this gap between the Italian work comes a project here, and he got a job in Italy, outside Bergamo, with a friend of his, Armando Malvestiti. There were a series of jobs. This is the one that was finished. So these are the housing projects. Winscombe Street, Fleet Road, Alexandra Road, Bergamo, and then finally in Eindhoven, the Medina. So that's the canon of work as housing. With the Projekt Zwollsestraat coming in and overlapping in here. Oh, it's jumped. This is a map of, this is the Hague, that is the North Sea, and there's a fishing village on the edge of the Hague, Scheveningen, and it has a very nice fishing harbour and a beach. And the people of The Hague in the summer go and sit on the beach. And there's a road that runs up to the beach called the Zwollsestraat. And there's a site here that had been a railway station. Here it is. And the trains stopped. The railway station was cleared away, and it became a car park. Tram terminus here, and then the front. But this is a very popular destination when the sun shines for people to visit. And so they would come in and they would park on this car park. And this is our site that runs along there. And on that site, they wanted us to put the largest underground car park yet to be built in the Netherlands. 2,000 cars, which means digging, oh, that was not a good button. There we go. Which means digging down 5 stories. Now, if you observe closely, up here is the North Sea. So if you dig down more than about half a meter, you're underwater. So we had to dig down, and it's like building a container ship. You have to actually dig down in the ground and hold it from floating up. So there's a huge construction that goes on the site before you build on it. These are the sand dunes that make Holland possible. Holland is only just level with the sea. A lot of it is below the sea. And Holland is the country the Dutch made by stabilizing the sand dunes and then draining the water from everything beyond. So these are protected. They are a natural wilderness. They're overseen by the Queen of the Netherlands, who has a house a little further down the coast. And so anything that's built into the sand dunes is treated with great care. So they wanted us to build at the highest possible density on this site. And you can see little houses here, little houses here, little houses here. And we had to build up against them and talk with the neighbours, go through a consultation process. But really what the site demanded was something very big indeed. And this site had been banging around from a period really after the Second World War. And various schemes have been put forward for it. And none of them has succeeded. But what happened is they had an ambitious deputy mayor who was getting architects in to build in The Hague and raise the profile. And what they looked at and suddenly realized is they had a site which was kind of Alexandra Road shaped, right? And so they thought, and so there's a phone call to Neave. He kind of described it. He got a phone call one day saying, would it be all right to meet with us? And suddenly there's a delegation and then another delegation. And then it wasn't a competition. It was a direct commission. And so we teamed up to do it. 2 ex-local government officers running a massive project from a little office in Camden Town. But it had various restrictions on it. We could build as high as we liked over here. But once we get here, we had to keep down to 3 or 4 stories. And this building here is a tram terminus that sends trams into The Hague. And that's where they go to sleep at night. They don't sleep for very long. Could we build a students' hostel on top of it there? By the way, while we keep the trams running. And this is a terminus for North Sea gas. And so it comes in and they have to reduce the pressure of the gas. So that has various requirements on it. And the sand dunes being protected, if you dig down 4 or 5 stories under there, you are in danger of polluting the water in the dunes, and the water in the dunes is their drinking water system. So we had to protect the dunes from the building. In other words, it was bloody complicated. I won't go into detail, but I did have a quote. I don't think Kester is here, but Kester Rattenbury, who you will know, we gave a talk on this in 1991 at the RIBA, and I will try and avoid what she said. Explaining the scheme took a pretty big lump out of the lecture. It was difficult for us poor audience to follow. What it must have been like for the architects, I shudder to think. But it was a man-eating project. And I think what they saw the shape, if you like, of Alexandra Road, but they also, I think they saw Fleet Road, which looks like Dutch architecture from the 1920s, J.P. Oud, for example. It looked Dutch, much more Dutch than Alexandra Road, but it was Alexandra Road shaped. There we are. Next one. That's an early sketch. And what we were trying to do is to make an edge to the town, fronting this wilderness of the sand dunes. This is where the gas terminus would go, the gas reducing station. To make that into something more than just a block of concrete coming up the ground. So it's a bit like a bastion. And then we had to build low here, but we could come up higher here. But to make an edge to the town and then build over the tram terminus. Now this has been built, but not to our design. These are photographs of the surrounding streets, not taken at the time. This is street view. But you can see a very small scale of streets and houses, very dignified buildings, very domestic. And what we did was to show our view of Holland, in a sense. So this is Vermeer, this is view of Delft, so this is the edge of the city. And these are De Hoek. So this is 17th century Dutch painting, where they're, in a sense, inventing a domestic culture. And what we knew is we'd have to have very careful modulation of the scale of the building to make it into a livable environment. And so these were shown, and they were partly, in a sense, wouldn't it be nice to have something like that? Partly to test out the idea. That is to say, can we make a space of about that size and that depth with red bricks is what it had to be built of, under that sky and the changing conditions of that sky? Would it work? So these were, in a sense, an aspiration and a Templar, if you like. This shows the scheme finished, and it's only one of two I'm going to show. But you can see the traffic problem. A lot of traffic coming in, and they had to park underneath the building. That's our building, as built by others. Hang on, go back. So people would come in, and they'd come into the car park here, and then 4 levels underneath. And the people who were parking, many of them came from Germany. And the relationship between Holland and Germany is a good one. However, people were not entirely keen about having Germans parking their VWs and BMWs in their streets. So they had to be kept separate. One thing we were very keen to do is to maintain a sort of frontage. This is the road that runs in from The Hague. And this is trying to hold the frontage together and to make a boulevard to get into the town. And with the idea, really, of trying to tidy up the urban spaces of the town. This is the car park. These are more complete drawings, but it shows you the kind of thing we had to do. There it is. You come in on the Zwollsestraat, you come down a ramp. There's a whole circulation system. And then you have to be able to get out of the thing, of course, and there's a petrol station here. All this had to be knitted in. Now, this shows, in a sense, the way of working, which is a very initial diagram, which is to say, if we have to make this tank full of cars and then build on it, we know how big a car is. A car parking bay is 2.7 meters. So you're going to end up with a cross wall in the apartments of 5.4. 2.7 is much too narrow. So that's just saying, okay, that's how many apartments you want. If we run them like that and like that, how many can we get on? And that's the section cut through, and that shows it. And then there's sunlight. How would the sunlight get through? Can we get the sunlight through? And we did a calculation, and it comes to about 400 if you really push it. They wanted 500. And we kept going backwards and forwards. Oops. And this shows the same diagram evolving. So this is the same diagram. Onto it, if you have a garage, you have to have means of escape to get out of it. So you know how far apart they have to be. And here we were making an opening so you could look out at the rest of the site. And we just diagrammed how the building would be. And I don't have the drawing, With Mark Swennerton, we've been going to the RIBA archive where all these drawings are. And some of these taken with my camera or Mark's, going along going, well, that's an interesting one, click. So the quality is not good. This is actually a screenshot from a talk Neave gave at the Balaga Institute in 1992. And it's another version which we've yet to locate. And what it shows is on elevation, this building, and there it goes, oh! And suddenly it's the Empire State Building. And so we showed this to the city and the client saying, if that's what you're asking us to do, and the logic of the distribution of the dwellings for other reasons is sound, it means that. And they took it very, very seriously. And then said, in a sense, well, it's your problem. And so we were struggling to make a livable environment at this very high density. This is a very early sketch of it. And what it shows is over the garaging, building, you could build a terrace along as a frontage to the Zwollsestraat, and then a terrace at the back. Could we get a third layer of housing between there and there? And we were very doubtful. Again, it was looking, you can see the beginning and the making of little spaces. There they are. Could we fit it that way? The answer was, in the end, that we couldn't do it. You can't get the geometry to work. I've jumped too. And this is the sketch I showed earlier. But going back to this slideshow that Neave gave at the Balaga Institute, he also showed this. And there is a sense in which I've been going back through this work after nearly 30 years and all these drawings. It's very strange to go back and you find how much has changed. But all of these drawings have they're like little etchings in a way. The more I looked at them, the more medieval they looked. And in a sense, Neave was the power behind the project, but we talk an awful lot. And we never said, let's make it. We talked a lot about the city edge, but how we sort of matched it up, it just seemed to sort of happen. But there is a sense in which we were making a medieval bastion. And this is the final project. This is the students' hostel that sits on top of the tram terminus. This rather fine building was 5 stories on the site. The Dutch were quite influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and this is a rather nice brick building. And this is our building. This has come up as high as we could push it. These have come up to 10 stories. This is 5 stories. But the whole idea was people would come in, park their cars. Those people would come out of their cars onto the boulevard, and they would either walk down here to the seaside or maybe cut through. What they wouldn't do is get into this environment, which had to be domestic and private and small scale. And it was the battle to keep this environment and do it well enough to make it livable that in the end broke the scheme. We withdrew from trying to design the apartments quite early on, and then we were retreating. But it was trying to protect the quality of these spaces that was very important. And what you can see is this is a block with social housing. None of this is social housing, by the way. Social housing gets talked about a lot. I never know quite what it means, but all of this is to some degree commercial. This stuff was going to be expensive. This is the honeypot up here, where they could build on the dunes. So that's, people buying it. But these are a private rental, but not what we would call social housing. But this is a little square. You come up or up a ramp, and then you're in an arcade, and it goes all the way along to the end, and it makes a place at the end. There's a place here which addresses this space here. There's a place here that looks up the site across the dunes. What we proposed is, as they had to juggle the water table, we make a little tiny lake or pond there. And early on, we thought it would be great to make a greenhouse here in a kind of Victorian way. It's by the seaside, so you can have a folly. Go up in the greenhouse and look where the greenhouse, of course, went. But the idea was to make a series of linked spaces there, 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 and there, to control the space and make this very sensitive internal environment. And we saw this as a landscape, and of course that as a landscape. So two contrary landscapes of different scales played off against each other. These are sections to it. The first design we did we proposed an arcade to run along and link the dune side buildings with the boulevard side buildings with split levels, which they thought was interesting and immediately rejected. Within Dutch building technology, you just can't do it. But a lot of this thinking goes back to thinking that went on in, for example, Winscombe Street, where you could have a dwelling on more than one floor, and the children had to put one home within the home, and the adults would have another home, and they could have a certain degree of separation and so on. So there are ideas about social mix that got beaten out quite quickly. But what we were trying to hold on to is this, which was an arcade that would link the whole thing together, like the spine of a fish that would hold it together. And this is a little sketch that Neave did of the internal environment, this very sensitive internal environment we tried to make. And these were proper drawings that we got someone to do to explain, this very domestic scale that we were trying to achieve. And these are sections to it. I won't go through it in great detail, but this is this car park, which we referred to as being an underground cathedral. And south is this way, so we thought, well, if you can get light down through it, if you're down there, you can always, there's out. You can look up a flight of stairs and be connected. But this ties it together, and it was the juggling of these spaces that was the big task in it. Okay. And lots of drawings. But there's the cathedral underneath. And then trying to make this delicate landscape of small-scale spaces against the big ones. And this was the idea of this looks from the sand dunes. This is what you would see. So there'd be towers, and behind that is the arcade, and then the back of the dwellings that confront the Zwollsestraat. And this is looking from the dunes. And this is drawing, trying to imagine these towers, and so on. Now, going back through it, we made a model. The client, who's a developer. One of the problems is we were brought in by the city and then teamed up with the developer. So it was actually initiated by the city but led by a developer. And they paid for us in London to have this very nice model made. And so we had a model made, and it's beautiful. These are the houses we designed. That's made out of a quite light hardwood, I think pear. And then there's perspex, you can see, for the transparent parts, sometimes slightly rubbed. The sand dunes, here's layered cork, and what they did is to crumple up the cork to make this lovely surface to be the sand dunes. There's the arcade that runs through. This is the terrace that confronts the boulevard. These are the towers. And these are two more photographs. It was very interesting because they looked at it, and I think it wasn't what they expected. It wasn't what they expected. And what I tell you about it, it smelt wonderful. We took it over in the back of Neave's Passat on the ferry, and you took this perspex top off, and it smelt of cork and pear wood. But what our client really wanted is to have a proper model made here out of white perspex, which, by the way, smells of nothing. Maybe a little bit of glue, and the glue doesn't smell very nice. And I'm telling you this kind of story because it's the difference of sensibility that we were hitting. This is the arcade that would run through and tie everything together, based partly on the Albany, which is certainly in... Has anyone been there? Just off Piccadilly? It's very difficult. I did once get invited to one. It is wonderful, not very Dutch. We made a beautiful model, again, out of wood to try and convince our client that it was worth having. That didn't really work. And this is a little bit more of the project, a bit closer to. So you come in here, and this serves all the lower dwellings, and then the towers. But this is modulated, this space, by these stairs up into the apartments. There's a little stair, and then every now and then one has a lift as well to get lift access. And a space here, and a space here, and a space here, and a space here, and a space there. Okay, and we worked out all the flats just like you'd expect. Okay, that's the basic overview of the scheme. There's me on site looking somewhat younger and a bit cold. That's Paul Bontenbal, our associate architect. We were coming out the ground. It got this far. We'd retreated on doing the dwellings. We were retreating and retreating. And then we got a message saying that they were going to strip out really the arcade. And at that point, we had a decision to make, which is whether we could continue with the project in its stripped-down way. And we did sleep on it overnight, and then we came in and shook hands, and we resigned, which meant we had to close the office. It was not an easy decision, but that's how far it got. And it's been built. This is what it looks like built. So this, actually, in a clumsy, it's been built rather inelegantly. And then this is the honeypot. This is where they built in the dunes, and these are individual houses that have been built. Okay, so it's a sad story, but I think it's worth going back over it, because actually there are attitudes and ideas in it which I think are worth discussing. Because I'd been teaching in China, so I've become aware that Neave is doing things like Neave Brown plays the Hackney Empire and gets a sellout audience of almost entirely young architects who give him a standing ovation. Well, that's wonderful. I was in China, so I missed it. But suddenly there's a revival of interest in Neave. So I just think it's very useful to go back through and try and think about what he was doing, some of which is still applicable, I think, and some isn't. Certainly in terms of cold bridging and thermal insulation and things, and actually the form of the way that this building is made, you can't easily transpose it, but there's some basic ideas in it. And right at the beginning, this is Fleet Road. Right at the beginning, when the Dutch were coming over and looking at the work, we were walking down one of these alleys that run to the front doors. And one of the Dutchmen asked what that was. What is it? And it's a handrail that's put there. And he said, well, what's it for? And Neave, who is one of the most articulate people imaginable, did not have a kind of, because it was there because we felt it should be there. And there it is, it's in dark stained wood, slightly curved the arises, so you can run your hand along it. And it was to do with actually modulating the proportions and the feeling of that space. And our very nice Dutch colleague, we heard him say, waste, waste. And what we were hitting was a very different mentality, which was Calvinist. Do you know what I mean by Calvinist? It's a kind of extreme Protestantism, which which is distrustful in a sense of the pleasures of the flesh, of things finally made. That's wasting, our labour should not be wasted on such things. We should be purifying ourselves. And there's a very strong streak of utilitarian Calvinism that still exists in Holland. And in a sense, they could see this and recognize part of what they thought of as modern architecture, but this bit, which is wasteful, and they're partly for the pleasure of it. And this comes from Kester's writing up of the lecture we gave. And Neave said, well, looking at us, him and I, through Dutch eyes, the Dutch would see this as sheer mamby-pamby humanism. And so this is a sheer mamby-pamby humanist's manifesto. And I crossed out theory because I thought in architecture school, Neave was not really a theorist. He was one of the most articulate describers. He was a very, very good teacher. He was not what would stand now as a theoretician. He didn't think so, and I don't think other people would have done. And there's a very nice description he gave of designing Fleet Road. And what he says, I think, is rather lovely. The design worked itself out through its making. And he talks about the temptation to sort of rationalize it and tidy that process up. He says, in fact, you only really discover what you do by doing it. Of course, at the back of your mind are all sorts of complicated motives and memories and references. But just as with painters, these sources are not hierarchical. And sometimes you seek out a reference only after you've developed something, which is really rather honest about things. So there are things about it which are about a feeling and a sensibility. Now I put down the clicky device. Here we go, and I found it. But the core ideas, one is that you're not designing housing, you're designing part of a city. And that was, in a sense, I wouldn't say easy, but in London we knew the city. Whereas in The Hague, the nature of the Dutch city was more mysterious to us. But you're not making just housing, you're making part of the city. The other one I think is very important. Continuity is the inescapable characteristic of housing. And by that, it wasn't just the continuity of the fabric of the city, the streets and the frontages and so on. It certainly meant that. But also, in a sense, the social and cultural continuity. That if you're brought up in a city, you get to know how to walk down the street. You get to know how to find someone's front door. You get to understand the pattern that's there. And so this idea of continuity was very, very important. And he was also interested in the concepts that hold housing together, relate all the bits together. The arcade is one of those. How do you tie it together and make the public space? And after he built Alexandra Road, he wrote about it in Architecture Review, and he talks about the common and traditional devices of formal control, which means steps, and in the Zwollsestraat, they become these little towers that have steps in that find your way in. And these are the essential devices of coherent urban development. So the idea of the city being hopefully coherent, that we can make our way, we can understand it, is very fundamental. And this is the namby-pamby humanist manifesto. So it's a consistent agenda. If I go back to this Neave wrote in 1966. The reason I went to work for him, I didn't know what the architecture would look like. I'd seen the drawings. I'd read an essay he wrote called The Form of Housing, and it made sense to me. And because of that, later on, lost and bewildered after leaving architecture school, I found someone who was working for this guy at Camden, and so I inveigled my way in, went and had a pizza at Pizza Express with John Green, who was the sort of deputy borough architect, and ended up working for Neave. But that's why I went. The architecture was still in the making, but it's because he'd written about the streets and so on, and he wrote about it in 1966. And what we did, looking back at it rather cheeky, when we wrote the initial proposal for the Zwollsestraat, we said, as we said in 1966, and just repeated it, as a manifesto, it's amazingly consistent. And I've been going back, I'm not a historian, I'm just going back to the things he wrote, which is not a lot, is this amazing consistency about the ideas. So, making part of the city, continuity, rather than the tabula rasa, which is this thing of wiping the slate clean, and looking for deep patterns. I'll just click through and do it as we come. This is one of Neave's life drawings, which he was doing, I think it was Tuesdays, Janet. When he was doing Alexander, he'd go off from Camden in the evening and draw. And they're fantastic. And then I'm going to show you a landscape in a minute. Later in his life, he went to art school and started painting. The one really interests me, one is the word physique, which is one that he was using a lot when we were doing the Zwollsestraat. The physique of the building, working on the physique of the building. It's a lovely word. But when you look at this, this almost became a joke, for Neave, it's not all this, it's the knuckles, and it's the ankles, and the toes, and the ball of the foot, and so on. It's these bits that join everything together that are almost obsessive. So you can actually see an analogy between staircases at Alexandra Road and so on. So it's these knees, ankles, and so on, which are the devices of coherence that make the body coherent. The thing about the tabula rasa, this is Le Corbusier 1928. This is Paris. And the group he was with at the AA, Ken Frampton, Adrian Gale, Patrick Hodgkins, and so on, they loved Corb, but this was really abhorrent. And I think it is the generation after the war that knew what Berlin looked like at the end of the war. It was a pile of rubble. And one of the reasons why the French, in the end, capitulated in front of the German army is Hitler said, we will bomb and destroy Paris. And they went around bombing other little towns, building up to it. And the French, in the end, said, here are the keys to the city. So the idea of doing this for this generation was abhorrent. But you can see the difference, really, of something which tries to knit in and create a new synthesis, which is, in the end, very modern, but doesn't have this wiping of the slate clean. And the other thing about this is you then have to imagine the new people. You have to reinvent the people to go in. You have the new man. It was never woman, new man. And this is Fleet Road. And who is this, Jan? This is from Mark's book. It's one of your neighbours. But this is Fleet Road. And what I would say on the left, this is Le Corbusier and the new man working out. There's his adoring new wife looking at him from above. And this is really architecture trying to expand horizons for people. And Winscombe Street and Fleet Road and Alexandra Road is predominantly family housing. We now get things like social housing. We don't get family housing. That's disappeared. And I'm going to read another little quote. When this was reviewed in 1978, Ed Jones, who had been a neighbour of Neave and Janet's in Winscombe Street, wrote the review. And it's very good. He starts out talking about the context of mass housing. And there's a phrase, mass housing. No one talks about mass housing anymore. He says, he talks about what he calls a reductivist aesthetic. Well, I'm not quite sure this is reductivist, but it's pared down. It is certainly not attempting to be cozy and neoclassical. Ed says the apparent freedom of flexible space in the Projekt Fleet Road invariably induces in the occupant a paralysis due to the exclusion of the familiar signs which prompt usage. It doesn't look like paralysis to me. And it's very interesting. There's a debate going on at this time about, in a sense, how much you design in and how much you leave out. And these are, in a sense, very designed, and people have adapted to them. I mean, some of them, they've ripped things out. Some of the walls which were made out of blockwork have been plastered over. But really, this is about making new horizons for people, not trying to reinvent people, but to make new things possible. And this is a landscape from, Neave did almost as many landscapes as he did nudes, again in charcoal. I mean, they're beautifully done. And it's rock, but out of the rock comes gorse. And so it's hard and soft at the same time. And particularly since, actually the tail end of when I was in China and I started teaching here, I've been going to Alexandra Road quite a lot, partly taking students from China and from here. And this is Alexandra Road. And I don't have the video, but I went there one day, and what I became very aware of is the wind was blowing. And so the trees at the top there, now I just put the pointer down, at the top above the building are the big trees in the park behind. And they're doing that. But all the little ones here, they're doing that. So you get a kind of shimmy between the little ones as the wind blows and the big ones. This is Fleet Road. And this is really the making of a landscape almost as much as it is the making of the hard surfaces. And certainly with the Zwollsestraat, we were talking about the internal space as being a landscape counterposed with the dunes, which is a very different one. And when I worked for Neave, there he is. This is Fleet Road. Here he is looking out from the living room. Most of it was designed. What hadn't been designed was what would go on these areas. I won't go into detail of the design, but these had to be designed. And so I was a young assistant. It's while I was doing this, I did my RIBA Part 3. So I did a sort of, it was a slightly dish deal design making these spaces. And what Neave called these areas were parterres, which is a French term used generally in classical landscape architecture, about places you look over, a landscape that's designed, often geometrically, that you can walk through, but actually it's to look down on. And so, and there it is, looking down onto a series of parterres. So you get these foregrounds that build up like this, often planted, and writing later, much later, about this. The whole idea between Alexandra Road is it's built a little bit after these blocks. And those blocks, Alexandra Road is one of those blocks laid on its side. And it's kind of ironic that at the end of the road is the past, if you like, and Neave is the future. And he wrote that the irony of, in a sense, this street framing that. And he also describes in this photograph that this is, if you like, the relationship of this to that is as a parterre. You look over it, and this is all the public spaces in the public life. So the idea of the parterre, I think, is important. And it is again, the parterre, again, is another of these knuckles, ankles, and so on. There was an article written in a Dutch magazine that compared Alexandra Road with Ada Rossi's Galeratese, which is up here. And Neave mentioned this in a lecture. And what he said is, the Rossi is a stripped building that is reduced to its absolute essentials. You can see what he means. Alexandra Road is an orchestrated building with surface detail and profile, done with a kind of plasticity that would be alien to Rossi. And I think he's right. And when I put these sides together, I'd just came back. And people do sit out on the terraces. Not much going on here, But then about 3 days ago, there's a website called, what's it called? Design, one of those. And someone has been back, oh, it's jumped. And there it is. But it looks pretty sad. What was reassuring is to see that the maintenance in Italy is almost as bad as it is in London. But it is the idea of an orchestrated building and this concern for surface and detail. And one of the words Neave used a lot was interval. And interval means usually a measuring of time, a gap in time. But he would use it to talk about the interval between that and that, or that and that, and that and that and that. And he would also use the phrase grace notes. These are sort of embellishments to a design, which are not to do with being reductive and utilitarian. And so the idea of the building, if you like, is frozen music, which is a very old one, is important. Going back a bit, before he started on housing, Neave had 2 periods working as a local government officer. It's not what you do if you want to be a member of the avant-garde. He worked for Middlesex County Council and designed 3 schools. And then he went to work for Camden, having had a short period in private practice. And in that period, he was being lined up, I think, to become the new editor of Architectural Design magazine. And he did a review of this building, which is by Atelier 5, who were 5 young Swiss architects who'd worked for Le Corbusier, and got this fantastic housing scheme outside Bern. And he visited it, but also at the same time, he went to a project really, I think from about 1935, by, again, another group of Swiss, Alfred Roth and 1 or 2 others. And what was interesting is when he writes about this, because this is so much like Neave's work, he's actually at the end really rather praising the modesty of this. And really as if this is really being a bit stagey. He thought this stuff was maybe just too expressive and so on. And it's quite interesting that he did that. Because you then look at Alexander Road and you see that you don't need, strictly speaking, 2 flights of stairs to get to 2 front doors that are just a few feet apart. So it's not pared down. But at that time, and this is one I took on Monday, Mark, at the RIB archive, he was designing schools, and the whole how you compose a school is a very different thing to how you compose a bit of the city as housing. The other thing, have I jumped to? Yeah. The other thing is I go back to the chronology. There's Winscombe Street, Fleet Road, Alexandra Road, then the Gap. And the Zwollsestraat came in the Gap, but so did Mozzo, the building he built just outside Bergamo. And it's very beautiful. When he talked about it, he talked about several things. One is that he was working with Italian builders. And I remember as a young architect talking to him, and he talked about tower blocks and system building as the government's way of destroying the craft-based building industry in the United Kingdom. And I think there's quite a lot to be said that's what happened. Whether it's deliberate, I don't know. It certainly happened. And suddenly he's coming across builders who do things like, look at the drawings that the architect has made. And he talked about, as if they were using a magnifying glass. And that they would take them and work very accurately to them, but they would then interpret, a little bit like a musician working from a score. And that was really, I think, very moving. He talked about also the day on site when within this project there are spiral stairs in reinforced concrete. And the message came from site that they were having trouble with the building regulations. And to actually get the steelwork calculated and through the building inspector, or the Italian version, was proving to be a nightmare. but the builder had got this suggestion that maybe he might listen to, would that be all right? And the suggestion was, can we build it in marble? So he acquiesced and built it in marble. But suddenly, there's this level of craft skill that's happening. And then we hit Holland, and they're saying, handrail, waste. Ooh. So I think Bergamo is wonderful. It wasn't a great introduction into going into Dutch building construction. The other thing that's going on in this period is, being in Italy, I think was a huge pleasure. I mean, you're an architect, and suddenly you get to build in Italy. Wow. And so suddenly Vignola comes on the scene. When we were in Camden, I don't remember Vignola, but when we were doing Zwollsestraat, he had this big book with photographs of Vignola. And this is one of the gardens. This is the Farnese, the Villalante Gardens. And he talked about the composition of 1, 2, 3, and then closed. 1, 2, 3, and then closed. And then on this, it's open there, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then open. So it's the sort of opposite. But there's this sort of love affair, again, goes back into landscape, but also with Italian architects like Vignola. The other thing that was happening is he did a series of exhibitions, which I really think are quite important. One was Le Corbusier Architects of the Century. And about 3 of these were for the Hayward Gallery, which is a space he got to know very well. And the thing about designing an exhibition is you have to design a route through particular places. And often those places had big models and events in them. Early in the time we were together, this was coming to completion, and we had a young assistant, Richard Lavington, who now is McCraner Lavington. And we sent Richard down to Parkway to get plasticine, because what was going to be built within this exhibition was life-size reconstruction of the entry door to the chapel at Ronchamp, and also part of La Tourette. But it was actually, Richard was sent because we couldn't get casts of the concrete. So he had to go and surreptitiously get the plasticine quite soft, and then, while no one was looking, do a sort of mold of the concrete. But it's just building this stuff, one-to-one and so on. So I say it's not really a great preparation for then going to Holland and dealing with construction there. And this thing of making spaces. So this is a photograph from Le Corbusier, so models and so on, but it's this route between particular places. And I think he was a master at doing that. We're nearly there. This is the final bit I want to show. These come not from the Camden days. This is when he was designing schools. He'd worked after the AA for a practice called Lyons, Israel, and Ellis. At the AA, he was with this hothouse group. And then he worked at Lyons, Israel, and Ellis with James Sterling, James Gowan, Alan Cahoon, Richard McCormack, Eldred Evans. I mean, it was, again, extraordinary grouping of people. And that's how they learnt to detail. And these, which are packing pieces, all of these are designed. Every little bit. And the drawings we've been ploughing through. But all of these buildings, all the Camden stuff, was hand-drawn, everything. Every screw, every nut, every bolt, every timber fillet. Completely bonkers, really, you look back on it. But they're absolutely finely detailed and so on. And this is, God bless them, the Dutch. But, it's a different sensibility to that. And I want to finish with a little story. I've been teaching in China. And I have a very good friend there. She's German. She was the deputy urban designer for Hamburg and is now a professor of urban design there. And I took her around Alexandra Road. We were walking around, and she's really enjoying it. And then we walked through the park, and there's an area there, very carefully designed space, but there's no one in it. She said, that's very, very nice, David, but there's no one there. I said, well, actually, in the tradition of sort of London parks and squares, if you go to Bedford Square, there's no one in the square. It's there to be looked on. You know, the AA, you know, if you're the director, you look out on the square, and if you're a student on the top floor, you look out on the square. But you only go in the square on graduation day when the external examiners come. So they're not actually used in the sense of footfall. They're there to be looked at. And this space on Alexandra Road was actually intended to be a pub. But at the end of the negotiation, the publican pulled out. So it becomes another little parterre. And so with Andrea, we just looked at this space that was empty, and then we walked, and there's this space, and there it is. And yet again, if you go to Alexandra Road, you have to fight your way past the people making movies. But this is Adidas making a little film. And Andrea and I then, I wanted to take a little video, and they have a big bouncer. They thought we may, do I look like I come from Nike? You know, I'm not really. But up there, there's someone who's a dancer. These are getting ready. There's the film crew. There's continuity. There's someone with a script. There's about 18 people. And we were there for about half an hour. And what's interesting is it's a fantastically good space for about 18 people. What a great seminar room if the sun's shining. I mean, a great space to just hang around and so on. And I'm going to end with that, really. And that these spaces are getting reused. It's changing. But I think there are certain things about the making of these spaces externally which are as important as the interior. And that Neave is a sort of urban designer, a mamby-pamby humanist urban designer is what I want to leave you with. So that's it, folks. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to do my best. Okay, that's a bit of an hour.
Any questions?
There must be some. Hey. Hi.
Hi, thank you. I understand Janet Jack was the landscape architect involved.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about her involvement and how she worked with Brown?
Well, the park is redesigned by Neave, and then she's lovely. She came in and she did all the planting layout, as she did on Fleet Road. Okay. And it's a very important part of it. But it said she took the drawings and then just talking with Neave. Yeah.
It was restored a couple of years ago.
It's been restored, and I think there are bits of change, but actually it holds together.
Yeah.
And it's lovely to see them putting some care. I don't know how much money Camden make out of letting out Alexandra Road for the movies. Someone said they make £2.5 million. And, couldn't they put some of it into just maintaining it, you think? Thank you. But questions?
You said you didn't like the end result of the project in the Netherlands because it's like built by the builder. It was like,
well, they did their best.
So what didn't they do as best as you could have? Like, was it just the lack of the arcade? Or?
I mean, one is they just pared everything down. So there's no love in the building, in a sense. I mean, that sounds a kind of sentimental thing, but if you're a mamby-pamby humanist, then that's about the best you can do. But it was the draining of attention and care into very formulaic, the cheapest possible details. And you think, hang on, this is on the edge. I mean, The Hague is where it's not actually the capital city. I think Amsterdam is, but the Binnenhof, the House of Parliament, where does the Queen live, and so on. That's all in The Hague. And I think, well, come on, And when we signed up for the project, Andrew Diverstein, who's the deputy mayor, was hugely ambitious. He brought in Aldo Rossi, but he also built in Alvaro Caesar, Richard Meyer, a whole group of architects. It was big ambition, but in the end, he moved on to become the director of the Netherlands Architecture Institute. So there wasn't that political will to see it through. So it was left to, arguing about small details and go backwards and forwards. Speechless. Okay.
Regarding the housing estates, were you looking back at historical precedents? So, like...
I mean, like the 18th century, 19th century, yeah. I mean, I think it's very interesting because I've been going back. You know, I'm in China, I come back, and I'm kind of going on a journey of rediscovery. It's very interesting. But there's one talk he gave at the RIBA with Peter Barber, I think, and he spends about 25 minutes, and yeah, he's in his late 80s, and he gives a history of street making in London since the Fire of London, and the legislation, and you know how the land was partitioned off, and he just did it without notes and so on. And he was very historically literate, architecturally. So the big question is then abstracting from what when you learn, because if you look at Alexandra Road, you don't necessarily see one of the crescents at Bath. And following what Neave said, it is the degree to which it's in the forefront of your mind, or whether later on you think, you know, and it sort of comes up at you, I don't know. He would have to answer that, and unfortunately he can't. But he was extremely knowledgeable about, I mean, the exhibition of Le Corbusier, he was not just the designer, he was one of the curators. He met Le Corbusier and had lunch with him. I mean, he knew that work incredibly well. That generation did. I mean, it was sort of, you knew Alto, you knew Corb, you knew, oh, that plan, you know, page 15 of the 4th volume, oh, that one. So they were a very literate, architecturally literate generation in terms of knowing your way around buildings. And also around, to some degree, the classical canon as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. So my question is, this kind of street-based, high-density, low-rise urbanism seems very peculiar. Well, it's quite specifically British sort of response to modernism and its legacy. Do you think that's got, this kind of cultural aspect has anything to do with the fact that it didn't really, or the project in The Hague didn't take root? Is there, beyond the developers kind of washing it down, is there other kind of...
I don't know. I mean, at the time that we were finishing in Holland, they were suddenly talking about doing 20, 30-story towers. And you think, hang on, where are we going with that one? You know, that suddenly came out of the blue. But the Dutch like to shock. Rem Koolhaas is a very, very Dutchman. You know, the eternal super bright naughty boy, you know. And so there is a sort of element of shock. But I don't know. It'd be very, very interesting. I haven't really had this conversation with Tony Fretton, who went to Delft and spent a long time as a professor there, and has written about certainly the last Dutch project of Neave in Eindhoven. What now? And I haven't been back to Holland for a while. What now? Because it all moves on, doesn't it? It all moves on. Was that an answer, by the way?
Yeah, no, I just, the project, as it's finished, seems to be all about kind of quite a high-rise perimeter rather than this kind of terrace.
I mean, looking back on it, I think we could have pushed those towers that overlook the dunes up rather more. When we presented this in 1990, whatever, at the RIBA, all of our friends at the back kind of virtually hissing sell out, you know, because we had towers. Actually, I think the towers were fine. And really the big issue was not high-rise, low-rise. That was there. It's actually the quality of the environment. It's making that, you know, an environment that is, sounds corny, livable, that you want to live in. And I think one of the great spaces in London, I think the park here, is the garden behind the terrace in Winscombe Street, which is a sort of wonderful semi-wilderness, I mean, it's sort of fantasy world for small children to be brought up in, and it's absolutely delightful. And shared space in that way which again is sort of very difficult to get, or I think has been a dream in architecture for a very long time. Wow.
Well, just to pick up on the point that was being raised, I don't think you can say that this typology is kind of uniquely British and doesn't travel based on the experience of Zwollsestraat, because in Eindhoven, which was Neave's last project, also in Holland, it was that typology that they wanted, and it's based on a street. You know, it's as much based on a street as Alexandra Road, and it's a step section with the houses all having their own private garden, and then stepping down to that pedestrian street, and then it's got a barrier, because in a way it's like Alexandra Road. Alexandra Road had a railway right next to it. This has got a huge, big, not quite a motorway, but a major urban road behind it. So it's got a barrier, but they love it to death. I mean, they just love it. And Neave, you know, you mentioned Neave's name to any of the people who live in that place in Eindhoven, and they just think he's the best thing that ever happened in the history of the world. So I don't think, I don't think one can say it's a model that doesn't, that only works in a British context.
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing, I mean, I've talked about this before, and someone asked, how come it worked in Eindhoven but didn't work for you guys in The Hague? And I think one is that Neave learnt a lot from what went wrong in The Hague. That was one thing. And I say this thing being in Italy just before was not necessarily a good introduction. So he was kind of prepared for the very, toughness of the culture. But also he had, we got to know the man who became state architect for the Netherlands, Joe Konen, who was the master plan of Eindhoven. And Joe was wonderful, which is that quite shortly after the Zwollsestraat collapsed, Joe had been professor of architecture at Karlsruhe in Germany, and he was coming to the end of his tenure, and he suggested Neave. And so Neave, I think, spent 3 or 4 years going to Karlsruhe. But then Joe found that, he'd done the master plan, and he did a master plan, and it wasn't exactly, but it was kind of like Fleet Road, but stacked up in a certain way. So he had the political support, and I think I didn't meet Rob van Aken, who he worked with as an associate on it, but it sounded like that was an easier relationship than the one we had in The Hague. So it comes down to small things rather than things like typologies. It comes down to sort of understandings that you build and so on. But it did mean that it could be built, and as Mark says, it is very, very popular. And one of the reasons Neave got the RIBA gold medal is that the people on Fleet Road and Alexandra Road and Winscombe Street wrote to the president of the RIBA and said, pull your finger out, Often architects do some lobbying, but don't often get, petitions from the people who live in them. Not to say it's paradise, it's another part of the city. But people do knock on each other's door, don't they? They do. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much for...
Okay.